denomination strong as proofs of Holy Writ. So these are the words of the devilish Iago, and they emphasize the power of the Bible's influence to persuade and illuminate. Iago says he's going to use the scanty evidence of a handkerchief that Othello gave to his wife Desdemona to stimulate Othello's jealousy. He believes that this will be as persuasive as any biblical authority. Shakespeare alludes to the Bible more than any other literary source. Like everyone in England at the time, Shakespeare was, in the words of Article 6 of the Church of England's 39 Articles of Religion, encouraged to believe that Holy Scriptures containeth all things necessary to salvation. These are also printed in the Common Prayer Book, that amazing resource. He knew his audiences would recognise allusions to the Bible when they heard them. He could take that for granted. So this article asks, how might we characterise Shakespeare's use of the Bible, his own proofs of Holy Writ, and what do they tell us about his art as a dramatist? The Bible saturated the cultural life of Shakespeare's time. It was the text, intimately connected to the hearts and minds and ears of the English people, a light in the darkness, shining for Protestants and Catholics alike. As Psalm 119 puts it, thy word is a lantern unto my feet and a light unto my paths. That's verse, I can't tell you the verse, I have to look it up. Psalm 119. The first royally commissioned Bible was the Great Bible, and it was published in 1539, and copies of it were issued across 9,500 parishes in England and Wales. Between 1526 and 1611, 11 new translations of the Bible were published. When the Book of Common Prayer started to be used in parishes from 1549, the whole of the New Testament was read 3 times over the course of a year, and the whole of the Old Testament, most of it, almost once a year. And all of the Psalms, as I said earlier, were read once a month. And there were 142 different editions of the Bible that were printed between Shakespeare's birth in April 1564 and his death in April 1616. Scripture was readily available, and not only in book form. Stained glass windows have already been mentioned this morning, but it was also present more prevalently in painted cloths and tapestries in people's houses, written and painted on the doors of the walls of churches, taverns and domestic interiors. And biblical scenes were depicted in paintings on canvas and boards. At the end of today, I'm going to a party in a hotel in Stratford-upon-Avon called the White Swan on Rother Street. And in there you can see a wall painting based on the Book of Tobit from Shakespeare's time. The wall painting dates from around about the mid-1550s. It's a space that Shakespeare would have known. The family who lived there was known as the King House or the King Hall in Shakespeare's time and town. If you were to guess which character in a Shakespeare play alludes to Scripture most, who would you say? If you were to say of all of Shakespeare's characters, the one that when he or she opens his or her mouth mentions or alludes to Scripture most, more than any other character, who would it be? Hamlet. Hamlet. Any other suggestions, please? I can see why you think Hamlet. Sir John Falstaff. Oh. I know. Large, drunk, whoremongering Sir John Falstaff. And he is the character who alludes to it most, and inaccurately. Or with that very Falstaffian clash, which picks up on your question about the playhouses and Christian discourse. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff, which is on in Stratford at the moment, it's a very good production, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. It opened on Wednesday last week and it's been receiving 5-star reviews. I saw it, I like it very much. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff is staying at the Garter Inn in a room painted about with the story of the prodigal, fresh and new. So he's staying in a room which is telling him the story of the parable of the prodigal son, as he himself is the play's greatest prodigal. I think it's a marvellous irony. Biblical stories and quotations could be heard in ballads, as well as from pulpits. And for the young Shakespeare, the study of scripture, as I mentioned earlier, formed part of his grammar school curriculum. And since Shakespeare's culture was saturated with the Bible, it's sometimes difficult to tell whether Shakespeare, in alluding to it, is being self-conscious and deliberate or not. And that's a key question. How self-conscious do we think, how deliberate do we think his allusions to the Bible are? Anyone working on Shakespeare's use of the Bible owes an immediate debt of gratitude to 2 scholars. Nazib Shaheen, for his extremely useful biblical references in Shakespeare's plays, 1999, and Hannibal Hamlin for his thorough and important study, The Bible in Shakespeare, 2013. Shaheen estimates that Shakespeare refers to the Bible at least 1,160 times across his plays, but he does not include the narrative poems or the sonnets in his reference book. And Shaheen's estimate, as far as I can see, is conservative, but the number of times that Shakespeare alludes to the Bible across his works therefore remains a bit beyond us, since it also depends on how we identify an allusion. What do we actually mean by this? So the translation of the Bible, and there's therefore a great deal of work still to be done in this area. The translation of the Bible Shakespeare uses most often is the Geneva Bible, which was first available in English in 1560, and it was first published in England in 1576. The Geneva Bible was the first complete English translation to be based directly on the original Hebrew and Greek. And both the 1560 and the 1576 editions include detailed marginalia, illustrations of places, people, objects and animals, and maps. Among Shaheen's 1,160 identified allusions, he notes that only 80 refer to other Bible translations other than the Geneva Bible. All of Shakespeare's references to the Psalms, however, allude to our friend Miles Coverdale, because they're BCP Psalms, they're Book of Common Prayer Psalms. And they had first appeared in the Great Bible, and that was the Psalter that was used in the Book of Common Prayer. It was imported from the Great Bible. So the entire culture of the times regularly read the Bible and heard the Bible in church. And although the question, did Shakespeare always allude to the Bible in a self-conscious way, is unanswerable, it's possible to identify different kinds and depths of allusion. And given the cultural prevalence of scripture, some allusions are likely to be less self-conscious than others. Shaheen demonstrates that Shakespeare alludes most often to the Psalms, then to Matthew's Gospel, and the other books to which he often alludes are Genesis, Exodus, Job, Proverbs, Isaiah, Ecclesiastes, and the apocryphal books, and the apocryphal book Ecclesiasticus, and to the New Testament books Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Revelation. And Shaheen's important, though at the moment it's just incomplete, yet indispensable study of allusions indicates that overall Shakespeare refers to 62 out of the 66 main canonical books, and to 11 out of the 14 apocryphal books. This is significant. How we understand Shakespeare's biblical translations has shifted over time. So you can study the history of people studying for Shakespeare's biblical allusions. So they, for example, the study of biblical allusions might be to do with biographical interpretation. If you understand Shakespeare's use of the Bible, you can then therefore say things about his intellect and his morality and his culture. Or it might be to do with literary and dramatic appreciation. Or it might be to do with Shakespeare's own theology and spirituality. In the 18th century, it was the morality of Shakespeare's use of the Bible that began to be noticed and commented upon. The scholar and Shakespearean editor Lewis Theobald was among the first to identify Shakespeare's biblical allusions. Elizabeth Griffith's The Morality of Shakespeare's Drama Illustrated was published in 1775 and was dedicated to the great actor of his age, David Garrick. She includes observations understandably characteristic of the 18th century. For example, in relation to the Archbishop of Canterbury's comments on Prince Harry's moral reformation in Henry V, consideration like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise. Griffith comments, "What a beautiful and poetical allusion is here to the circumstance of our first parents being exiled from Eden. The keywords Adam and paradise are enough for her to notice and formulate a passing allusion to the book of Genesis." Hannibal Hamlin notes that as we moved into the 19th century, Shakespeare leapt from being an 18th century moralist writer, alluding to the Bible to set forth examples of good behaviour, into becoming a divine writer, propagating Christianity. The title of one such study, by T.R. Elton in 1858, serves to represent the century's principal kind of focus in this field. Shakespeare and the Bible, showing how the great dramatist was indebted to Holy Writ for his profound knowledge of human nature. Shakespeare's use of the Bible was thought to characterise his own spirituality and was a way of accounting for nothing less than his genius. This tendency reached an extreme and, according to Hamlin, possibly deranged expression in Charles Downing's God in Shakespeare, the course of the poet's spiritual life, with his reflections thereon and his resultant conception of his world personality inductively established by the text. I think perhaps it didn't sell like hotcakes. And in 1890, 11 years later, Downing's long poem, that was in 1890, and 11 years later, in 1901, was Downing's long poem, The Messiahship of Shakespeare. Anyway, these are just illustrations of how this topic was being considered in the turn of the 20th century. And by the turn of the 20th century, Shakespeare had become almost synonymous with Scripture. In 1905, the influential critic A.C. Bradley represented a more secularizing view of Shakespeare and understood the function of Shakespeare's biblical allusions to be illuminating of human action rather than illustrating or presenting his own theology. When we look to 20th century studies of Shakespeare and the Bible, we find that they are in part characterised by what we can call typological approaches, readings that set forth biblical themes in Shakespeare. So typological interpretations, for example, look for Cain and Abel's in Shakespeare, brothers against brothers, and there are several of these. For example, in Richard III, in As You Like It, in Hamlet, in King Lear and The Tempest. Typological interpretations will look for Christ-like figures. For example, Richard II, Henry VI, the Duke in Measure for Measure, King Lear and Cordelia and Coriolanus. Or you might look for prodigal sons, for example, Proteus in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing, Prince Harry in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, Bertram in All's Well That Ends Well, to which we might add a prodigal daughter, Kate, in The Taming of the Shrew. Other typological readings see relationships between whole books of the Bible and individual plays, as the critic Stephen Marks does in his study Shakespeare in the Bible in 2000. This was published in the Oxford Shakespeare Topics series by OUP. Marx considers the stories of Moses and David in relation to Henry V, for example, the book of Job in relation to King Lear, Measure for Measure, and Measure for Measure in relation to the Gospels, and the Merchant of Venice in relation to Paul's letter to the church in Rome, and the book of Revelation in relation to the Tempest. As well as alluding to the Bible from memory, it's likely that Shakespeare noted down biblical quotations to use later. Now, I imagined him writing down psalm verses and psalm themes in his commonplace book. And I think probably he did the same with biblical allusions and indeed classical allusions. And phrases from the Bible could have been gathered under many different themes in Shakespeare's commonplace book, but I thought I'd give you 37 of them, one for each play. Praise, love, faith, doubt, friendship, war, suffering, freedom, cursing, the natural world, penitence, lamentation, the law, sin, the devil, revenge, cries for help, healing, prodigality, wisdom, temptation, blessing, revelation, treason, resurrection, mercy, justice, visions, prayer, angels, mortality, identity, exile, memorialization, empire, betrayal, and kingship. And just as I said exile, someone came into the church and then left again. Anyway, that's just an example of just how rich you could have your commonplace book and have these as themes and be gathering all sorts of allusions under each other. And then you'd always have something to write about. Oh, I need something on kingship. Oh yeah, I'll go back to the commonplace book. So how would Shakespeare then set about using them? Shakespeare alludes to the Bible to burnish a dramatic moment or a poetic one, to enhance an articulation, to lift it momentarily from the page or from the stage, just as biblical quotations are meant to enhance and improve somebody's lived out daily experience. Biblical allusion in Shakespeare makes moments resonate, and this word I used earlier in relation to imprisonment, by enlarging a sense of being for the speaker, the character, and for the audience. So you have a sort of tripartite enlargement effect. The actor speaking, the character speaking, and the audience hearing. And each of those three are called on differently to empathise and sympathise with the character. Hannibal Hamlin recommends making the distinction between whether the character is speaking scripture knowingly. For example, when Henry V asks for Psalm 115 to be sung after the Battle of Agincourt, non nobis. Or whether a character is speaking a biblical allusion unknowingly. Now, most of Shakespeare's biblical allusions are spoken unknowingly by characters on stage. The point being that the actors and the audience knew that they were suddenly hearing scripture, and that therefore we have some kind of analytical perspective on the dramatic moment and the characterization. Shakespeare uses the Bible overall deliberately and for dramatic, emotional and intellectual effect, I would argue. A modern comparison might be the use of background film music. The characters cannot hear it, but the audience knows that the music relates to the film's narrative, the characters' inner lives, whilst the audience's own emotions are being stirred and defined by the soundtrack of the film. That's, I think, as good a comparison by way of illustration I can draw. That it's a bit like modern film music, how Shakespeare's using the Bible. The following two examples illustrate different authorial intentions. The first, Shakespeare, in the first, he's alluding to Matthew, chapter 10, verse 29, and when Hamlet is anticipating what we fear will be his fateful duel with Laertes, he alludes to the Bible knowingly and to his friend Horatio. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be not now, it's not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man has aught of what he leaves, what is to leave betimes. Shakespeare underlines the moment by alluding to Matthew's Gospel. Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? Hamlet, who says earlier that he does not set his life at a pin's fee, is now able to reassure himself and the audience with the words of Jesus that his life is in the hands of God. He seeks our sympathy with the view that since we leave everything behind us when we die, the precise moment of death should not matter that much. He's ready to die. In the second example, Shakespeare underpins a comic moment by alluding to the sound and rhetorical shaping of Scripture. It's background music, to use the earlier filmic comparison, rather than its actual meaning. So here we go, this is Henry IV Part 1, and it's Falstaff exaggerating the severity of his having been attacked on Gad's Hill. I escaped by miracle. I am 8 times thrust through the doublet, 4 through the hose, my buckler cut through and through, my sword hacked like a handsaw. And I think Shakespeare here is alluding to St. Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth. 5 times received I, 45 strikes save one, 40 strikes save one. I was thrice beaten with rods, I was once stoned, I suffered thrice shipwreck, night and day I've been in the deep sea. Shaheen characterises this example as Shakespeare writing with possible echoes, but it's surely more deliberate than that on Shakespeare's part. He is portraying Falstaff's exaggeration, lies and irreverence by alluding to the tone of voice used by St. Paul to describe his own much more serious and real sufferings. Shakespeare sometimes uses the same biblical allusion for different effects. Now these are on your handout. So the example which is going to run through all of these is Exodus 3, verse 14. In case the Israelites ask who sent Moses to liberate them from slavery in Egypt, Moses is given God's name in a voice that speaks to him through a burning bush. And God answered Moses, I am that I am. Also he said, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. First the voice of Iago, who, in Act 1, Scene 1 Othello, says to Rodrigo, I am not what I am. Iago has just said, heaven is my judge. In going on to explain that he is only showing outward loyalty to Othello, Shakespeare has one of the most malignant characters render the name of God in the negative form. Later, Iago will soliloquize about his own divinity of hell. In Act 4, Scene 2, just after Othello has cruelly struck Desdemona in front of her kinsman, Lodovico kinsman Lodovico, Iago adapts Exodus further and says of Othello, he is that he is. I am not what I am is also the phrase that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of Viola, disguised as Cesario, speaking to the Countess Olivia in Twelfth Night, or What You Will. Stay, I prithee, tell me what thou thinkst of me, that you do think you are not what you are. If I think so too, I think the same of you. Then you think right, I am not what I am. I would you were as I would have you be. Would it be better, madam, than I am? First we hear Viola's, you are not what you are. Then Olivia's reply, and Viola's punchline, then think you right, I am not what I am, because she's in disguise. Through this illusion, Shakespeare solicits laughter, but the joke indicates something more serious. Both Olivia and Viola are trapped in an apparently hopeless situation of mistaken and hidden identity that only an apparent miracle, a divine revelation, can liberate them from, as it will about 45 minutes later in stage time, when Viola is reunited with her twin, Sebastian, whom Olivia has married, thinking he is Cesario, that is, Viola in disguise. This is a kind of godly working out in a comedy. The third example of this same illusion comes when Richard III wakes up after his nightmare on the eve of the Battle of Bosworth. What do I fear? Myself? There's none else by. Richard loves Richard, that is, I am I. It's clear from Shakespeare's alluding to Exodus 3:14 that he wants his audience to know that Richard should be feeling fear, the fear of God, but Richard in his total self-absorption and sin cannot see that. He can only see within that word, those words, himself. Like totally dominated by ego at this point. The fourth example is in alluding to Exodus 3:14 is Sonnet 121, and it's the only time in the canon when the phrase appears in its correct biblical form. It forms part of a meditation about not judging others' behaviour in love. No, I am that I am, and they that level at my abuses reckon up their own. So I am as I am, and if you accuse me for my sin, then you're also aware of your own. So these four examples from a tragedy, a comedy, a history play, and a sonnet, and indeed from across about 17 years of Shakespeare's career, resonate differently and are embedded in their contingent narratives and requirements as far as characterization and tone and moment are concerned. In each instance, Shakespeare wants his audience to think about the Bible. How far these moments of self-revelation, Othello, withheld revelation, Twelfth Night or What You Will, mistaken personal epiphany, Richard III, and a meditation on love, Sonnet 121, recall the original context of the biblical verse, which is God's self-revealing, Moses' vocation, and the eventual liberation of the Israelites, will depend on how we read, hear, and interpret them. Hamlin suggests that the potency of biblical allusions for Shakespeare is nearly always contrastive or ironic. They sometimes may seem almost blasphemous. The Bible was a particularly rich source for allusion because not only was the book familiar to Shakespeare and his audience, but it came with a deeply ingrained ideological baggage. The Bible mattered to a superlative degree, which gave consequence to biblical allusions in literature. Now, when you think about the allusions from that point of view, we're really touching hot material, it seems to me. How much the Bible mattered to Shakespeare's audience can be illustrated by Shakespeare's allusions by two of Shakespeare's allusions to Psalm 8, verse 4 to 6. They are, what is man that thou art mindful of him, the Son of Man, thou visitest him. Thou madest him lower than the angels, to crown him with glory and worship. Thou makest him to have dominion of the works of thy hands, and thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. The psalm permeates, doesn't it, Hamlet's reflection on the nature of human being? What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Hamlet's antic disposition is itself based on a biblical analogue. King David's feigning madness to protect himself from King Achish of Gath in 1 Samuel 21. Leaving aside the question of how far Hamlet means what he says because of his antic disposition, and because he's speaking these lines to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Shakespeare certainly means his audience to recognise his allusion to Psalm 8. Hamlet adapts the psalm from a prayer praising God for the glories of humanity into a self-reflection on mortality. A few years later, Shakespeare uses the same allusion during the raging of King Lear on the heath, when he sees the disguised Edgar as Tom o' Bedlam. Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Ha! Here's 3 ons are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. The allusion to Psalm 8 is set against the pagan world of the play. You might recall Edgar's having described his own humanity as nothing a few scenes earlier. Edgar, I nothing am. And now we see him being contradicted by a reminder from Scripture, what is man, that thou art mindful of him? The allusion might prompt us to consider both Lear and Edgar as Christ figures. Lear is experiencing extreme suffering, which involves madness. Shakespeare presents Edgar stripped of everything, and Lear asks us to consider him well. Those words might recall the soon-to-be-condemned Jesus in John 19:5, of whom Pontius Pilate famously says, Ecce homo, behold the man, except that it is King Lear who is dressed in royal robes and whose crown of suffering is being cruelly exposed. So it's a very rich allusion if you really start to unpack it. So in at least 2 of the sonnets, Shakespeare calls to mind the great love poem of the Bible, the Song of Songs. No surprise that he should be alluding to that in his love poetry. We read in chapter 1, verse 4, I am black, O daughters of Jerusalem, but comely. Shakespeare's sonnet 127 begins, in the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. If Shakespeare's poem is a meditation on his mistress, then calling to mind Solomon's song helps him to find a language of comparison and praise. Sonnet 130 is properly regarded as Shakespeare's playful debunking of 2 centuries of Petrarchan love tropes. But Shakespeare is also surely alluding to the Song of Songs, chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thine eyes are like the doves among thy locks. Thine hair is like the flock of goats, which look down from the mountain of Gilead. Thy teeth are like the flock of sheep in good order, which go up from the washing, which every one bring out twins, and none is barren among them. Thy lips are a thread of scarlet, and thy talk is comely. Thy temples are within thy locks, as a piece of pomegranate. Thy neck is as the Tower of David built for defence. 1,000 shields hang therein, and all the targets of the strong men. Thy two breasts are as two young roes that are twins, feeding among the lilies. Sonnet 130 can be read as though it were inspired by the scriptural passage and written in response to it. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses, damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she, belied with false compare. Shakespeare's evocation of a goddess and heaven creates ample room for us to find a scriptural as well as a Petrarchan influence on his sonnet. The Petrarchan tradition also looked back to the Song of Songs, so Shakespeare is inviting us to question both the biblical text and the entire literary trope in a single poem. Once an allusion to the Song of Songs is identified, Shakespeare's reading of the Hebrew poem contrasts with the pious and Puritan marginalia in the Geneva Bible. These define the poem as being about how Christ delighteth in his church. He commandeth all that is in her. He hath respect to the multitude of the faithful, which are many in number. So the powerful eroticism of the Song of Songs becomes rather simplistically theologized. Solomon's mistress's breasts, for example, are interpreted symbolically, wherein are knowledge and zeal, two precious jewels. Shakespeare has none of this. He's just not interested in that theologizing of the Song of Songs. And he reads the Song of Songs rather as an erotic love poem, which of course it is, an inspiration for his own debunking sonnet in appreciation of the truth of his mistress's beauty. So it's a very individual engagement with those words from Scripture if we're asking ourselves what is going on in terms of what this allusion to the Song of Songs reveals in relation to that sonnet. It's quite justly one of the most famous sonnets ever written. Shakespeare's use of the Bible is difficult to characterise because it produces a variety of effects, as you've just heard. How can you start to say, oh, he used the Bible in this way? It's as if you've got to go to every single allusion and think about it. Primarily, the impact of his allusions serves to elevate and enhance his poetry and drama, that we can say. Sometimes his use of scripture makes a moral point, like Iago. In fact, an analogue or source for Iago's malignance, which is so often of interest to critics, actors, directors, why is he so evil? Why is he wanting to destroy Othello? Can itself be found in the Bible, and I've never found this in any edition of Othello. So look to Proverbs 16, verse. Is this on your handout? Is this on your handout? 16 verses 27 to 30.
Yeah.
Now, I think this provides a little character point of origin for the character of Iago, who's like totally evil. It's not been noticed before in these books of biblical allusions or in editions of Othello. A wicked man diggeth up evil, and in his lips is like burning fire. A froward person sows strife, and a tale-teller makes division among princes. A wicked man deceives his neighbour and leads him into the way that is not good. He shuts his eyes to devise wickedness. He moves his lips and brings evil to pass. That is exactly Iago's project and Iago's character in biblical form. Shakespeare's moral use of scripture is self-reflectively highlighted in The Merchant of Venice, when Antonio, using a well-known aphorism, says of Shylock, "The devil can cite scripture for his purpose." A comment which reflects also badly on Antonio himself, as well as on Shylock, whom Shakespeare portrays as Antonio participating in an ongoing dialogue of hatred between Jews and Christians in Venice. In his extensive use of scripture, and because of his knowledge of the Bible, Shakespeare's own poetry and phrasing often seem to have a scriptural resonance. Now, 3 Shakespearean phrases spring immediately to mind here. His kisses are as full of sanctity as the touch of holy bread, says Rosalind of her beloved Orlando in As You Like It. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, bliss in our brows bent, says Cleopatra to Antony. Nay, sure he's not in hell, he's in Arthur's bosom, if ever man went to Arthur's bosom, says Mistress Quickly when reporting the death of her old friend and lover, Sir John Falstaff, in Henry V. These 3 examples, holy bread, eternity, and the account of someone dying, all arise from love and are revealing of a personal spiritual experience. Mistress Quickly's Arthur's bosom is often explained as a malapropism for Abraham's bosom, the destination of good people after their death, as in Luke 16:22-23. Abraham's bosom is where we are told the sons of Edward sleep, the 2 princes murdered by Richard III. But let us suppose that Mistress Quickly really does mean Arthur's bosom. If so, then Shakespeare is adapting scripture into his own sacred English text. His works are shot through with thousands of these sorts of golden moments and phrases. In Cymbeline, when Posthumus is reunited with his wife, Princess Imogen, they both thought that each other were dead. We hear, "Hang there like fruit, my soul, till the tree die." Even the resolutely atheist Virginia Woolf was eager to admit that it is because of such lines as these that Shakespeare's characters, which she once criticised as being cut out with a pair of scissors, talk divinely. Posthumus, in crowning the moment of his reunion with his wife, is in fact also alluding to Psalm 63 verse 9. "My soul hangeth upon thee, thy right hand hath upholden me." And that's another allusion that escapes the notice of Shaheen and Hamlin. So this talk began with Iago, and it ends with Princess Imogen. Deliberately, I'm evoking as poet John Keats and his understanding of Shakespeare's negative capability, which he writes about in one of his marvellous letters. And he says by that he means when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. In the following year, Keats praised Shakespeare for taking as much delight in an Iago as in an Imogen. What shocks the virtuous philosopher, writes Keats, delights the chameleon poet. Keats's comments allow Shakespeare's use of the Bible to be as much about delight as about religion and morality. Biblical allusions can be carefully defined and limited. Biblical narratives and character types can be identified across the plays. But as an artist, Shakespeare sets out to create, to be original, playful, even audacious. He was an English Bible-reading, Church of England Christian. In appropriating scripture into his own poetry, Shakespeare had an English scripture in mind, and one that he made his own. The Bible helped him to understand and articulate his own creativity and its purpose. Keats's famous admission, "I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination," resonates with Shakespeare's own intimate knowledge and understanding of the Bible itself. Shakespeare uses the Bible, even at times emulating its sounds and its tone, to enhance, elevate, and enlarge his own poetry and drama. He was able to make himself sound like Scripture, its spirit, its rhetorical shaping, and perhaps he was not always overly conscious of so doing. His works are shot through with many hundreds of these sorts of biblical and biblical-like golden moments and phrases. His use of the Bible is creative, adaptive, and indicative of his own independence as a reader, thinker, and man of faith. If we want to understand Shakespeare, both the man and his works, as fully as possible, then we must engage with his use of the Bible. The Bible was part of Shakespeare's poetic voice. It helped to make Shakespeare Shakespeare, and has enabled him to become our other sacred text in English. Thank you for listening. So, a lot of careful negotiation in that talk about what an allusion is, how they're used, how many, how Shakespeare's reading the Bible of his age, and then some examples of how he's taking in the influence of the Bible into his own poetic and dramatic tone of voice, his own writing style. So we pause with our registrations online. Thank you for joining us, and we have some